The ground in the high Rockies does not know mercy. It moves. In the spring of 1886, this movement was a sound, not a crash, but a slow, agonizing groan of wood fiber tearing apart, of tenon pulling from mortise. It was the sound of Elias Thorne's homestead, the largest in the Argentine Valley, dying its second annual death. Thorne, a man of considerable means and military engineering experience, stood on his porch, watching the muddy, ice-flecked water of the thaw run against his foundation, pooling where his massive 18-inch spruce sill logs met the dark, saturated earth. Inside, his wife was stuffing rags into the 3-inch gap that had opened in the north wall, a wound torn open by the frost heave. The cabin, built just 2 years prior at a cost of over $700, was a fortress. And like all fortresses, it was slowly being destroyed by the very ground it was built to command. 3 miles up the valley, on a slight, unassuming knoll, Silas Vane heard nothing but the drip of water from his eaves. His cabin, by contrast, was a trifle. It looked temporary, almost frail, perched atop what appeared to be 9 simple piles of flat grey stones. The snowmelt, which gushed in a torrent past Thorne's property, split around Vane's knoll, and the water that ran under his home simply kept running, emerging on the other side. His walls were dry, his porch was clear. While Elias Thorne was calculating the cost of logjacks and new timber, Silas Vane was sitting by his stove, sipping coffee and checking the edge on his axe. His cabin, built in a season for less than $50 in hardware, was entering its 3rd winter with not so much as a warped door frame. It needed no repairs. It would need no repairs for decades. The secret was not in the logs, but in the space beneath them. A design so simple, so effective, and so contrary to the frontier's brute force ethos that it had been entirely forgotten. What did this quiet, solitary Welshman understand about gravity, water, and time that an entire generation of seasoned American pioneers, backed by manuals and military engineering, had completely missed? The year was 1884. The Colorado Rockies were not a place for the ambivalent. This was the raw, unformed edge of America, a land of brutal opportunity. Silver strikes in the high mountains were pulling men and capital west, and the railroads followed, inching their way up canyons, demanding timber, fuel, and food. This demand created small, fertile pockets for homesteaders, like the Argentine Valley, a high-altitude basin 9,000 feet above sea level that promised good timber and summer pasture. But the promise of summer was paid for by the debt of winter. Here, winter was not a season, it was a siege. Temperatures regularly fell to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 34 degrees Celsius, and snowpack was measured in yards, not feet. The official pamphlets from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, eager to sell land, offered advice on construction. They were based on methods proven in the gentle hills of Pennsylvania and the flat, stable soils of the Midwest. The Homesteader's Guide championed the standard American cabin. Clear a flat patch, dig a shallow trench, and lay your heaviest, largest sill logs directly on the earth or on a bed of gravel. Bank the earth high against the walls, the guide instructed, to provide natural insulation against the winter's cold. This was the conventional wisdom. It was the doctrine of mass. A heavier, deeper, more anchored structure was a warmer, safer, more permanent structure. Elias Thorne, a former Army quartermaster, was a man who lived by the book. His cabin was the valley's showpiece, the very picture of what the guide mandated. It was a monument to conventional wisdom. Let us examine Elias Thorne's fortress as a case study in orthodox failure. It was built in 1884, a 30 by 40-foot structure made from spruce logs, some nearly 2 feet in diameter. The foundation was a textbook example of the best practice of the day. Thorne's men had dug a 2-foot deep trench, filled it with river gravel, and set the massive hand-hewn sill logs directly into this bed. They then banked the cabin, piling earth and sod against the exterior walls to a height of 3 feet, just as the manuals advised. The theory was simple. The Earth's mass would buffer the wind and stabilize the interior temperature. The reality was catastrophic. The problem was not the cold, it was the water. The banked earth, piled against the wood, acted like a sponge. It trapped every bit of moisture from snow, rain, and melt. The sill logs never had a chance to dry. By the first spring, the north wall, which received no direct sun, was already showing signs of Coniophora puteana, wet rot. The wood became soft, punky, a dark, fibrous mush. But the rot was a slow-acting poison. The frost heave was the blade. The ground in the Rockies does not freeze uniformly. The south-facing side, warmed by the winter sun, would thaw slightly during the day, while the north side remained frozen solid. This differential movement, known as adfreezing, gripped the massive foundation and twisted it. The 60-ton structure, meant to be immovable, was lifted, torqued, and dropped. Year after year, the chinking, a careful mixture of mud and grass, shattered. Doors refused to open, windows broke. By 1886, Thorne was spending 5 weeks of his precious short working season and over $150 in lumber and hired labor just to jack up the cabin, replace rotted sections of the sill, and re-chink the gaps. His cabin, a symbol of frontier success, was a thermodynamic and structural nightmare. Silas Vane was not a product of the American frontier. He was a product of the Welsh coast, born in a village where men had built with stone and fought the North Atlantic for 1,000 years. His father was a dry stone wall builder, his uncle a lighthouse keeper's assistant. Vane had learned 2 essential truths before he was 16. From his father, he learned that a wall that fights the earth will be broken by it. A wall must be built to breathe, to move with the heave of the frost, stacking stone on stone with no mortar, allowing the land to shift beneath it. From his uncle, he learned that water is the true enemy, and the only victory is separation. A lighthouse is not built in the water, it is built on a solid pier above the water. Vane had worked in quarries, seeing firsthand how a tiny fissure in granite, filled with water and frozen, could split a 10-ton block. He came to America not for gold, but for quiet. When he arrived in the Argentine Valley, he did not immediately stake a claim and clear-cut the land. For 3 weeks, he sat on the mountainside. He watched where the snowdrifts formed in the wind. He watched the path of the sun. Most importantly, he returned during a spring rain shower and watched how the water moved. He saw the gullies, the sheets, the places where it pooled. The other settlers, busy with the sounds of axes and brute force, called him Lazy Vane. But Vane was not idle. He was designing. He was listening to the wisdom of the place, and it was telling him that the American way was wrong. When Silas Vane finally began to build, his methods were a source of ridicule. He chose a site others had ignored, not a flat, sheltered meadow, but a low, south-facing knoll exposed to the wind. He cut no trees there. Instead, he began hauling flat-topped boulders and schist slabs from a rockfall half a mile away. He dug no trenches. He laid no gravel bed. Instead, he identified 9 points on the ground, 1 at each corner of his planned 18 by 20-foot cabin, 1 in the center of each wall, and 1 in the very middle. At each point, he began to build a stone pillar. He used no mortar, no mud. He simply stacked the flat stones, the largest at the bottom, the smallest at the top, fitting them together with a mason's eye. Each pillar rose 3 feet from the ground. Elias Thorne rode by one day and saw the work. "Building a hen house, Vane?" he called out, laughing. "The wind'll scatter those stones by first snow." Vane just nodded and kept working. When the 9 pillars were complete, he laid his sill logs, modest 10-inch pine logs, directly on top. The entire cabin was being built to float 3 feet above the ground. To the others, it looked absurdly fragile. "You'll freeze to death," another homesteader warned him. "The wind and cold will come right up through the floor." Vane merely smiled and began to meticulously insulate his floor, a 6-inch cavity between the joists, which he packed with dried moss, sawdust, and a layer of canvas. The cabin itself was a warm box, but it was a box that was completely, thermally, and hydrologically decoupled from the earth. The conflict in the Argentine Valley was not between men. It was between 2 opposing engineering philosophies. Elias Thorne represented the doctrine of brute force mass. His philosophy, shared by the army and the railroad manuals, was that a building must be an anchor. It must fight the ground, suppress the frost, and win by sheer weight. It was a philosophy of conduction, that the earth, with its stable deep ground temperature, could be used as an insulator. This was the logic of a root cellar. But a cabin is not a cellar. Silas Vane represented the philosophy of intelligent separation. He knew the earth was not a stable insulator. It was a heat sink in winter and a mobile enemy in spring. His doctrine was one of isolation. Do not fight the ground, never touch it. The 2 systems were a perfect contrast. Thorne's foundation was monolithic, heavy, and wet. When the frost heaved, it heaved unevenly, catching the massive foundation and twisting it, breaking the structure. Vane's 9 pillars were flexible. If one pillar heaved a 1/4 inch, the cabin, with the natural flexibility of wood, absorbed it. The dry stacked stones simply resettled. Thorne's foundation dammed the meltwater, holding it against the precious wood. Vane's foundation, high and dry, allowed the water and snow to pass underneath, completely untouched. Thorne believed the air under Vane's cabin was a fatal flaw. Vane knew that still air, in his insulated floor, was the perfect insulator, and moving air under the cabin was the perfect dryer, a constant breeze that ensured his sill logs would remain bone dry for a century. "Joe," as the first test of the 2 systems came not from a blizzard, but from an observer. In November 1886, a Mr. Arkwright arrived in the valley. He was a surveyor and engineer for the Denver and Rio Grande, and he was a man frustrated. The railroad was spending tens of thousands of dollars repairing its high-altitude station houses, signal huts, and water towers. They were rotting and shifting, just like Thorne's cabin. Arkwright was tasked with finding a design that lasted. He carried a logbook and, crucially, a set of high-grade thermometers. He arrived during a cold snap of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 Celsius. His first stop was Thorne's showcase cabin. Arkwright's notes are clinical. Interior temperature, Thorne. 58 degrees F, 14 degrees C, measured 3 feet from stove. 41 degrees by 5 degrees C, measured at north wall. Floor temperature at wall, 34 degrees, 1 degree C. Massive drafts noted. Fuel consumption, EST, 1 out of 3 cord per 48 hours. He noted the damp, cold feel of the air. That afternoon, he visited Vane's shack, as Thorne called it. Arkwright was deeply skeptical of the stilt design. He stepped inside and was immediately struck, not by heat, but by comfort. His notes: interior temperature, Vane, 64 Podrig, 18 degrees, measured at stove, 62 degrees, 17 degrees, measured at north wall. Floor temperature at wall, 61 degrees, 16 degrees. No drafts. Entire 18 degrees 20 space is evenly heated. Fuel consumption is to 1/4 cord per 72 hours. The data was undeniable. Vane was using less than 40% of the fuel to achieve a far superior and more stable interior climate. Arkwright's realization was a thunderclap. Thorne is attempting to heat the ground. His cabin is a heat sink. Vane's cabin is thermally isolated. The ground is irrelevant to his system. Mr. Arkwright, being a man of systems, did not just see a cabin, he saw a design. In his report, he deconstructed Vane's forgotten design into 5 layers of defense. The first layer was the mind, or sighting. Vane's choice of the knoll, which used topography to shed water and the sun's southern path to gain heat, was the intellectual foundation. The second layer was the boots, or the pillars. These 9 dry stack piers were the core of the invention. Their function was twofold. First, to elevate the entire wooden structure away from ground moisture. And second, to provide a flexible base that could absorb frost heave without transferring twisting stress to the frame. They cost nothing but labor. The third layer was the lungs, or the air gap. This was the 3-foot space under the cabin, which Thorne had mocked. Arkwright recognized it as a critical ventilation chamber, a convection engine that perpetually drew away dampness, keeping the pillars and the sill logs perfectly dry. The fourth layer was the core, or the insulated box. Vane had decoupled the thermal envelope from the structural foundation. His floor was an 8-inch thick sandwich of pine boards, packed with sawdust and moss. This box held the heat, and because it never touched the 10-degree ground, it wasn't losing energy to conduction. The fifth and final layer was the hat. Arkwright noted what others had missed. Vane's roof had 3-foot overhangs. Thorne's was built flush for a neater look. Vane's hat directed all snow and rain 3 feet away from the cabin walls, ensuring the chinking and logs remained dry. As Vane explained it to Arkwright, "A house is simple, sir. It only needs a good pair of boots and a good hat. If the boots keep it out of the mud and the hat keeps the rain off its head, the walls have very little work to do." The true defining test came with the winter of 1888-1889, known in Colorado history as the Great White Hell. It began with a blizzard that lasted 3 solid weeks, burying the valley in 15-foot drifts. It was followed by a record-breaking cold, settling at 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 Celsius, for 72 hours. And then the ultimate killer. A warm Chinook wind arrived, raising the temperature 40 degrees in a single day. A catastrophic flash thaw began. For the traditional cabins, this was an apocalypse. The massive snowdrifts piled high against the banked walls melted. This created a super-saturated moat around the foundations. The water, with nowhere to go, ran into the gravel trenches, which then refroze, expanded, and split the sill logs. At Elias Thorne's homestead, the result was total. The saturated ground, now a slurry, had no bearing strength. The entire west wall of his cabin subsided, sinking 8 inches, 20 kin. The main roof beam, under the immense weight of snow, cracked with the sound of a cannon shot. The fortress had fallen. Thorne and his family, fearing for their lives, were forced to evacuate in the middle of the deluge. Across the valley, 2 other cabins, built to the book standard, suffered similar fates. The Manning family's home, its foundation heaved, split its stovepipe, setting the wall on fire. In this chaos, Vane's system performed not just well, but flawlessly. The 15-foot drifts had formed around his cabin, but the wind had scoured the area under it clean. When the thaw came, the torrent of meltwater simply ran under the house and down the knoll. His 9 pillars were wet for 2 hours, and then, as the breeze passed through, they were dry again. The ground heaved, but the dry stack pillars moved with it, absorbing the shock. Inside, Silas Vane, with a stable internal temperature of 60 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius, boiled a pot of coffee and watched the destruction through his window, his home resting quiet and secure. The human impact of the 89 thaw was immediate. Vane's 18 by 20-foot cabin, the only stable, warm, and dry structure left in the upper valley, became a refugee center. He took in Elias Thorne, his wife, and their 2 small children. He also sheltered 2 other prospectors whose cabin had been crushed. 7 people were now living in a space designed for one. And here, the operational discipline of Vane's system became clear. The cabin was a sealed, warm box, but 7 breathing humans produce an enormous amount of humidity. Vane, understanding this, immediately implemented a strict ventilation protocol. He opened the upper sash of one window a 1/4 inch and cracked the stove vent. Thorne, horrified, protested, "You're letting the heat out." Vane pointed to the wall. "Elias, if we don't, the water we breathe will freeze inside the walls. We'll drown in our own damp." He had created a passive air exchange system. Cold, dry air was drawn in, heated by the stove, circulated, and then the warm, wet air was expelled. There was no frost on his interior walls. There was no cabin fever sickness. While Thorne, the man of brute force, had been defeated by physics, Vane, the man of systems, was now managing a microclimate, rationing his well-stocked firewood, organizing sleeping shifts, and keeping 7 people alive and healthy, floating peacefully above the mud and ice that had ruined his neighbors. When Mr. Arkwright returned in the spring of 1889, the valley was a scene of devastation. He found Thorne's magnificent cabin a splintered ruin, the sill logs visible, rotted and broken, in a sea of mud. He estimated the valley's structural losses at over $8,000, not including livestock or equipment. He then walked the 3 miles to Vane's Knoll. He found the cabin. It was perfect. It looked exactly as it had in 1886. The logs were dry, the chinking was intact, the porch was level. The data was absolute. Total losses for the Vane cabin, $0. Total repairs needed, $0. Arkwright's report to the Denver and Rio Grande was a masterpiece of engineering prose. It statistically proved the Vane Elevated Platform System, as he dubbed it, was not just superior, but the only viable method for high-altitude construction. The railroad, a corporation that cared not for tradition, but for a reduction in operating expenses, adopted the design within 6 months. All new signal huts, stations and water towers from 1890 onward were built on high-clearance, dry stack, or later concrete piers. The most dramatic conversion, however, was Elias Thorne. Humbled and bankrupt, he did not flee. He approached Vane not for a loan, but for an apprenticeship. That summer, the 2 men, the symbol of conventional failure and the master of the forgotten design, were seen working side by side, building Thorne's new, smaller homestead. It sat on 12 dry stack pillars, 4 feet above the ground. 20 years later, in 1909, the Argentine Valley was a different place. The silver boom had passed, but the railroad remained. The valley was dotted with ranches. A visitor traveling through would have seen the legacy of the Great White Hell. The hollows in the ground, the moss-covered, rotting logs of the first brute force cabins were still visible, like graves. But the structures that lasted, Thorne's new ranch house, the railroad station, the school, all shared a common, strange feature. They all floated, perched on stone or concrete boots, with a clear gap of air between their floors and the unforgiving earth. Silas Vane's original cabin was used continuously for 60 years. When a historical society surveyed it in 1947, they found the original 1884 sill logs. They were silvered with age, but they were perfectly sound, bone-dry, and had never been repaired. The frontier, it turned out, had not been conquered by force, but by quiet observation. The pioneers who sought to dominate the land had their work turned to rot. The man who had simply sought to understand it built a home that lasted a lifetime. The forgotten design was not about heavier logs or deeper trenches. It was about the humility to accept that a builder does not fight the ground. He respects it. And it was about the simple, timeless, and profound wisdom that the best way to win a fight against water is to never let it touch you in the first place.